Today, I want to start with a little bit of nostalgia. Ocarina of Time for a lot of people is their first 3D Zelda game, or maybe their first Zelda game ever. And I'm sure everyone remembers going out into Hyrule Field, wondering what the world had for them, and running into this little scenario. Personally, I think these little guys are underappreciated and kind of downplayed in what really is going on with them and the terrible tragedy that they imply. It always seemed weird and curious to me that Hyrule Field is absolutely flooded with these things. I mean, it's not every area in a Zelda game where you get constantly assaulted by undead, let alone small, childlike undead? They're called Stalchildren, and for good reason, but where do they come from and why are they infesting Hyrule Field? Well, the answer's pretty simple. There are three main places where you can find undead. The graveyard near the Shadow Temple in Kakariko Village, the Spirit Temple over in the desert, and the Lost Woods. Now, the Lost Woods is probably the most likely place for these to come from, considering the fact that the Shadow and Spirit Temples are more about ghosts than skeletons. Also, the Curse of the Lost Woods is kind of an obvious thing to get to. Any Kokiri who are lost in the Lost Woods end up turning into Stalchildren, whereas adults turn into Stalfos. Okay, pretty simple, so the very obvious conclusion is that these Stalchildren are probably Hylian children who got lost in the woods. And yeah, that's a very simple and easy conclusion to come to, but I want to look at the implications behind that. These children, after wandering into the Lost Woods, find themselves lost, confused, and probably terrified. Eventually, their minds and bodies start to deteriorate, and they turn into these skeletal fiends. They eventually wander out of the woods and try to go home, probably having only vague recollections of where they're from. But even if they have a little bit of their sanity left, they're seen as monsters and aren't allowed back in town for obvious reasons. Then they see this little boy wander out of the woods. One boy lucky enough to have not turned into a skeleton. It infuriates them, they attack, and ultimately they're defeated. Because let's be honest, what else are you going to do in Hyrule Field at 3 in the morning? But it goes a little bit further than that. Once you're an adult, you no longer find Stalchildren in Hyrule Field. Instead, you find Poes. I think that these Poes are the ones that probably weren't defeated and have shed their physical form to become ghosts. They fly around outside of Link's range and taunt him. And even worse than that, what do you do when you defeat them? You put them in bottles and you sell them to this guy. I think the fact that they can get out of that cage, but they're kept in by the simple threat of violence, is very implicative that they still have the mindset of small children. In Majora's Mask, we get a very different story for these, as they're soldiers of Icona, but here in Hyrule, they're just lost, dead children. But this little minor revelation also got me thinking, why does the Lost Woods turn people into undead in the first place? I mean, the Shadow Temple and the Spirit Temple are kind of easy to explain. You know, graveyards, ghosts. It all just kind of lines up, but the forest, why there? The first lead that I wanted to pursue is the Kokiri themselves. Now, I'm not going to say that they're actively creating undead, but at the same time, I think that it's possible there's a balancing act going on here. The Kokiri are immortal as long as they don't leave the forest, and they were explicitly created by the Great Deku Tree. So is it possible that the undead are created to balance out the Kokiri's immortality? I don't think the Deku Tree would have created the Kokiri to be immortal if he knew that there had to be a counterbalance. But at the same time, I can't imagine him being ignorant to it either. So that lead kind of falls short, and flat on its face pretty much immediately. But what else is in the forest? Well, my next thought would be the Great Deku Tree, but at the same time, as for the previous stated reasons, I don't see that being the case. Perhaps the Kokiri's emerald. Each spiritual stone is in a place that resembles the deity that they represent. The Goron's ruby is on top of Death Mountain, full of hardy Gorons, rough terrain, tough enemies, and it's very straightforward for the most part. It's about strength and power, very similar to Din. The Zora Sapphire is held by the Zoras, and it represents Nehru, the goddess of wisdom. The simple route up to Zora's domain is kind of like a puzzle itself. It's very indirect, you have to figure out where to cross. Even the frogs require some sort of testing experimentation to figure out what's going on here. You have to think about it, use your brain a little bit. It's, unlike Death Mountain, not very straightforward, and even getting to the dungeon requires you to think a little bit outside and wander around, find the letter. You have to use your brain a lot more than just, rush up the mountain and stab things. The Kokiri Emerald is deep inside of a forest, teeming with life, and I think that very well represents the natural cycle of life and death. The connection between undead and courage is pretty simple. Those who don't have the courage to face death are turned into undead. I think this would also help explain why there's so many Stalchildren, but not as many Stalfos. Simply put, adults tend to be a little more receptive of death, whereas children sometimes have a hard time grasping and understanding it, which would make it harder to accept. So perhaps the undead are a byproduct of the Kokiri's Emerald. But that doesn't quite fit. You see, the undead aren't limited to just the area around the woods or the little bit inside. There's more than just a few Stalfos and the Skullchildren. The most likely reason why this is happening dwells deep inside of the forest, where the undead tend to gather. Past the Skullchildren, past a small maze, past even a Wolfos, is the Forest Temple. And it is absolutely full of undead. There's Stalfos all over the place. There's other creatures that are just weird and eerie and don't resemble normal life. And then there's the Poe sisters, who may even be original inhabitants of this place. But what is the Forest Temple? What makes it so special and different? Why would it be the cause of the undead? There's plenty of theories about what the Forest Temple originally was, since it's honestly the most unique out of all the adult temples in Ocarina of Time. It's less like a dungeon and more like a temple, despite the fact that temple's in the name of all of them. It's ornate, it's decorative, and it doesn't seem to serve a single obvious purpose. One of my favorite videos discussing this topic is done by Zeltik, and there will be a link somewhere to that video. I'm not going to paraphrase everything, but I do have to agree with the general conclusion that this place is sacred, and that the room where you fight Phantom Ganon is very obviously meant to be well protected. But what could that reason be? It could be an entrance to the Sacred Realm, but it could also be another place of influence within the Zelda series. In Skyward Sword, there are several prominent places inside of the forest that the Forest Temple could have been built on top of. Between the Sealed Grounds and the Skyview Temple, these are two very spiritual places that it could have been built on, but I don't think either of those are quite right. There's one more place that is specifically linked to another realm that sits in plain view in Skyward Sword, and that's the Silent Realm, the Trial of Farour. Inside the Silent Realm, Link's spirit is separated from his body as he goes through this trial, and go undetected and unassaulted by spirit guardians. It very well could be that the room that you fight Phantom Ganon in was built on this exact spot where the entrance to the Silent Realm is. It's also very possible that the Silent Realm is in fact the Sacred Realm, or part of it at least, as when you do enter the Sacred Realm to collect the Triforce in Skyward Sword, it seems oddly similar, almost the same as the Silent Realm. This spiritual energy could be the thing that allows those who don't have the courage to accept death to rise as Stalfos, or any number of creatures. Now, this also got me thinking about the other Silent Realm trials. Think about it. Where's Nehru's trial? Far out in the desert, with old ruins, a place long forgotten to time before Link even shows up in Skyward Sword. Does that not sound a little similar to the location of the Spirit Temple? Din's trial is at the base of Death Mountain, and what in Ocarina of Time is at the base of Death Mountain? Kakariko Village, which is where the entrance to the Shadow Temple is. Both of these are the other places where you find large amounts of undead, and between the three of these places, the Shadow, Spirit, and Forest Temple is where basically all of the undead in the game are found. It's very possible that all three of these dungeons were built upon the different entrances to the Silent Realm where Link undergoes his trials. Deep in the forest, Farour's trial tests Link's courage, and upon that sacred ground was built the Forest Temple, lost and forgotten to time as no one wandered too deep into the forest. No one really would wander into the woods too much, as the lush fields nearby would serve as a much better place to build Hyrule on. Deep in the desert, already forgotten and abandoned, the Gerudo eventually build a temple there, and then the Shadow Temple, built at the base of Death Mountain upon the entrance to Din's Trial, which tests Link's power. These 3 temples go all the way back, not just as a background in Ocarina of Time, but all the way back to Skyward Sword, built upon the original entrances to the Silent Realm, and very possibly the Sacred Realm itself. We may never know for certain what the real story is, but I'd like to think that this is a pretty good explanation of what happened here, of where the undead come from and what's the purpose behind these temples, the history behind them. The Zelda series has always fascinated me with these little things that are never explicitly mentioned, but are heavily implied and left open for interpretation, much like the Stalchildren themselves. That said, there will continue to be more Zelda theories on this channel in the future, so you can, subscribe and whatnot if you want, so you know when they're coming out. And yes, I do intend to do other non-Zelda related stuff, and this video was originally just going to be a 3-minute look into the Stalchildren, and ended up developing into this whole thing. But that's half the fun. So let me know what you guys think in the comments, and get a little discussion going if you want. I'm always open to hearing you guys' opinions and thoughts, and maybe you'll feel more theories of mine. I don't know. Maybe this fuels more theories of yours. That'd be great. Either way, I'll catch you guys next time.